Today's world relies heavily on computers, and especially after coronavirus, we pretty much use computers to do everything. You literally cannot live in today's society without having a computer. We use it to work and to learn. It's very important to learn just how these computers work. These computers are made up of 5 different components: the motherboard, the central processing unit, the power supply unit, the memory, and the secondary storage. The motherboard houses all the different components of the computer except for the power supply. The power supply is still connected to the motherboard to provide power. The motherboard allows for all the different components of the computer to communicate and work together. The central processing unit does all the calculations for the computer. It receives the instructions from the computer, processes those results, and outputs it back to the user. It is often referred to as the brain of the computer and is a vital part of the computing. The next component is the memory. The memory houses all the data the central processing unit is using at the current time. It is known as volatile memory, which just means that after the computer is turned off, the memory will not be able to be accessed again because it is wiped. The more memory you have, the easier it is to multitask. The next component is the secondary storage. The secondary storage has all your files and programs, or in other words, data that you do not want to be deleted after the computer is shut off. All computers have all these components. These components are all necessary for a computer to work. And although they all might not look the same, every single computer has it. That goes for laptops, Macs, Windows PCs, and just regular PCs. Next, we will go on to see the different images of these components. In this picture, we can see that a man is placing the central processing unit into the motherboard. The central processing unit, or the CPU, is in the fingertips of this man. As I said before, it follows instructions, processes those results, and outputs it back to the user. The CPU determines the speed of programs, and a heatsink is often required because it gets very hot while in use. I can attest to this because I work with central processing units all the time, and one time I used it without a heatsink and it did get very hot. In this image, we have 2 different types of secondary storage. The hard disk drive, which is also known as the HDD, and the SSD, which is known as the solid state drive. The hard disk drive is one of the not really antique, but one of the older versions of the hard drive, or the secondary storage. The hard disk drive is much slower than the solid state drive. The solid state drive got up to about 15 times faster than the hard disk drive. And more oftentimes than not, if you have an old computer, the hard disk drive is usually what's making your computer slow. If you upgrade to a solid state drive, it would make it much faster, and the process really isn't that complicated. In this image, we have an example of the memory, also known as the RAM. As a reminder, the RAM is volatile memory, which pretty much just means that it's wiped after a power shut off. It stores all the data the central processing unit is using at the given time. And if you have more RAM, then it allows the central processing unit to have more data stored at a given time, which pretty much just translates into better multitasking. You could have one app running in the background while using another currently in your front desktop screen. And if you would go back to the app running in the background, it would more than likely still be open because of the RAM you have. This is the power supply unit. And depending on how advanced your computer is, that's how powerful the power supply unit it would be. There's not much to it. This is a very complex diagram of the motherboard, but we will only be focusing on certain aspects of it. Part E is where a power supply cable would go to power the central processing unit, and part I would power the rest of the motherboard. Part H is where the memory or RAM would be connected to, and part G is where the CPU would be connected to. Part L is where you would connect the cables to the secondary storage. And that's all the parts of the motherboard.